Greetings. I'm Dr. Rich McConnell, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Dr. Kenneth Long and Mr. Marty Lenners to discuss and talk about the effect of simple role-playing games on wargaming, webinar number 2. This is the second of a 5-part series of webinars that describe the mixed method study conducted by researchers and military professionals at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. The focus of this webinar is the literature review that helped provide meaning to the problem under study. Speaking of the problem, one of the central themes affecting this research was the concept of visualization, which bears some definition before we get into the meat of the literature review. Military professionals use visualization in many ways that might be familiar to civilians in other disciplines. During military operations, leaders attempt to answer the questions in the upper left-hand corner. The first priority is to understand what is going on in the environment, but that's not enough. As John Boyd described in air combat in the form of observe, orient, decide, act, or OODA, determining what is going on quickly to support a prudent decision potentially creates the chance for gaining an advantage over your opponent. That requires taking outside inputs, combining them with your inner library of education and experience, some of which comes from similar sources we'll discuss in the literature related to our study, then project either internally or for other people our visualized estimate. The leader who is best at visualization tends to anticipate opponent actions, react to those actions quickly, and get inside the OODA loop of their opponent. This is more than a military principle. Investment bankers who anticipate emerging threats, such as failing mortgage-backed securities, might be able to turn those threats into opportunities. See The Big Short. Visualization skills are central to what we studied during this inquiry into the effect of simple role-playing board games on the wargaming step of the military decision-making process, or MDMP. These visualization skills have a direct effect on 3 other concepts that we will explain next.
Before we proceed describing the context of the problem that we described in our literature, it is necessary to define some key concepts and terms, to include the art of command, the science of control, and mission command. Mission command is both a philosophy and a warfighting function, and taken together they interact with one another within the context of an uncertain and complex environment. Mission command is a balance of the art of command and the science of control. Military organizations tend to emphasize the science of control all too often to the detriment of the art of command. The detailed systems and procedures described in the science of control tend to be paramount within the hierarchical constructs of the military. Furthermore, it is far easier to teach young military leaders the tenets and checklists of the science of control via some more abstract ideas of the philosophy of mission command, that being the art of command. It is in this abstract, uncertain area where senior military leaders often struggle passing along their insights into and lessons learned from years of training and education to their younger, less experienced subordinate leaders and to the future of the Army. Mission command as a philosophy is meant to help commanders and decision makers balance the art of command with the science of control. The principles of mission command, such as building cohesive teams through mutual trust and creating shared understanding, help shape this philosophy. Oftentimes, this philosophy does not react well to a checklist method. Instead, it lends itself to a more artistic approach. Conversely, mission command as a warfighting function interacts more smoothly with the science of control and its emphasis on systems and tasks. We have learned that in an uncertain environment dealing with a multitude of complex problems, neither the art of command or the science of control alone suffice. Instead, it's the application of both the philosophy and the warfighting function that allows leaders to achieve the effective balance of art and science. These terms are designed to help commanders and decision makers anticipate the unforeseen threats and the unforecasted opportunities during planning. If these threats and opportunities are missed during planning, then they must be able to be identified during execution. Such information is referred to as exceptional. Building on our understanding of mission command, the effective combination of the art of command and the science of control, it is necessary now to discuss exceptional information and how it links to visualization. The 1997 version of U.S. Army Field Manual 101-5 is the clearest definition of the exceptional information from a historical military literature. The more recent 2012 version of Army Doctrine Reference Publication 5.0 further defines exceptional information as information that would have been answered had one of the CCIRs if that requirement had been foreseen and stated as one of the CCIRs. Note, CCIR is an Army acronym for Commander's Critical Information Requirements, or more simply, questions the commander and his staff are trying to answer. However, neither of these two published definitions are included in current Army doctrine. The military institution stopped defining exceptional information in the last 2 years, despite our recent and ongoing experiences that soldiers face ever-increasing unforeseen threats and unforecasted opportunities. I would invite you to reflect back on a past experience. Have you ever missed something during planning that emerged during execution in the form of an unforeseen opportunity or threat? If you have experienced the phenomenon of exceptional information. Your most experienced leaders will have been able to recognize it more readily than your inexperienced leaders. The question becomes then, how do you develop in your less experienced leaders the ability to recognize exceptional information when they experience it? How often do decision makers feel rushed when they are attempting to plan future operations? Do we become infatuated with our own ideas and become reluctant to questioning them? Do decision makers and the people that support them have a bias toward a certain type of thinking, such as critical or creative thinking? Do we make compromises when we're dealing with short-term timelines? Perhaps one way to look at our thinking is to examine the theoretical frameworks that might influence the way we think, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. For the purpose of this wargaming study, we developed our own theoretical framework we called the cognitive planning domains.
What you see on the left of the slide is the theoretical model we created for the wargaming study called the cognitive planning domains. And what you see on the right side of the slide is our attempt to apply the cognitive planning domains to the Army's military decision-making process, MDMP, as well as the scientific method. We will come back to that, what you see on the right, in a moment. First, let me describe the cognitive planning domains. We postulated that when people plan, they experience three cognitive domains: the factory, the laboratory, and the art institute, represented in this Venn diagram. In the factory, we are concerned with synchronization, coordination, and whatever the operational necessity might be. In the factory, we are quickly meeting needs given time constraints. This process is quick. In the laboratory, planners put on their white lab coats and focus on feasibility, relevance, and validity. Planners meet needs by experimenting with their ideas. This process takes longer than in the factory. In the Art Institute, planners meet needs using their imagination and anticipating. They employ innovation, foresight, creativity, imagination in an effort to predict and forecast what they have not been able to anticipate. This process takes the longest of all. In the center, where these three circles intersect, is the confluence of the art of command and the science of control. As the research team experimented with this theoretical model, we began to realize that the military tends to emphasize the factory because often there is an emergency that must be dealt with immediately. However, we began to realize that our planning process was created to incorporate all three planning domains, which leads us to what you see on the right side of the slide. What you see here is the visualization of the slide is the military decision-making process on the left, the planning domains on the right, and in the center is the scientific method. The military decision-making process, MDMP, starts with mission analysis resulting in a problem statement. At this step of MDMP, we are in the Art Institute, but in the scientific method, we are theorizing. In MDMP, once we have developed a problem statement, we transition into the laboratory and begin creating possible courses of action. We analyze those courses of action through the use of something called a wargame. Think thought experiment or process of stress testing the plan. But if we compare this to the scientific method, is when we are examining hypotheses, comparing those hypotheses, and through a test determining the hypothesis with the most probable chance of success. Once we have determined the course of action we want in MDMP and the hypothesis with the most probable chance of success in the scientific method, we transition to the factory, which for MDMP is orders production, but for the scientific method is the implementation of clinical trials typically. One of the things we found most instructive is the research team, when we compared these processes, was that the scientific method assumes that this process will be cyclical, resulting in multiple clinical trials before being successful. However, in MDMP, it is rare that planners cycle back to the initial problem statement to determine if they had addressed the problem or even got the problem statement correct. Such actions in MDMP presumes that our understanding of the problem was 100% accurate in our first expression of it. Military institutions could gain much by approaching MDMP from a more scientific method approach. It would be informative to assume that MDMP should be cyclical, employing the scientific method-like approach that incorporates relooking the theory, the hypothesis, and redoing the clinical trials. These ideas cause our research team to reflect on the notion that most planning is an attempt at dealing with uncertainty, which is an uncomfortable reality humans must deal with regardless of the endeavor, military or otherwise. The research team looked at a series of game theory variables in order to understand the problem we wanted to address. As covered in webinar number 1, the problem we were examining had to do with the systematic ability to examine plans according to military doctrine, i.e., to question them through the process of a war game. As a reminder, the wargaming process in military parlance is a step in the planning process where we stress test the plan by deliberately attempting to expose its weaknesses and fix them before execution. This is often difficult because many planners fall in love with their plans and are reluctant to poke holes in them. As a result, threats and opportunities are often missed that could have been anticipated during planning. This willingness to question our own plans precipitates a certain intellectual humility, i.e., being willing to be comfortable with the uncertainty in the environment that may cause us to be wrong. What you see here is an expression of the game theory variables that we used in the wargaming study. The research team viewed game theory variables as a tool to determine the level of comfort study participants experienced with uncertainty in their ability to visualize the unanticipated. On the right side, you see a sliding scale ranging from 1 to 6. For each game theory variable, how much information did the participants feel they had? The level of uncertainty, the level to which the problem responded to rationality. How much environmental complexity were they contending with while visualizing? Were they being asked to make a decision that was based on common knowledge to them? And did they feel they had enough time? Members of the research team found it fascinating to reflect on the uses of this protocol for decision makers to reflect on their comfort level with decisions that they made given the level of uncertainty/complexity they were experiencing while making their decisions. All of these ideas caused us to reflect on decisions as a process influenced by numerous variables.
Displayed now are a series of questions that decision makers may consider while attempting to arrive at a decision. Some of these questions may seem rather obvious, and perhaps you have made some of them today. While driving to work, we all decide where we are and where we hope to go. This seems to be rather simple. However, it can quickly become a complex problem if we do not know where we are in relationship to our desired destination. Again, I would ask you to reflect on decisions that you have made or observed in the past, but where the answers to the questions were unknown, where I am and where I want to go, but yet a decision was made regardless. What was the outcome? Have you seen decisions made that required actions that did not advance the group toward the desired end? Have you ever anticipated threats and opportunities during planning and had them actually occur? What about threats or opportunities that you did not anticipate? Were you quick to recognize these threats or opportunities, or do they make their presence felt by impacting your outcome? All of these questions and many others relate to what we described earlier as exceptional information. Although the military has stopped defining exceptional information, they do have a process designed to prepare decision makers for their emergence during execution that might drive a decision. For those that have seen the old Super Bowl commercial of building an airplane in flight, this displayed model is an attempt to help decision makers make decisions while in motion. On the left-hand side, you will see the beginning of the execution of a plan. If all went well, the straight line to the envisioned end state would occur. Many would assert that this is a rare occurrence, that our visualized operations occurred as we anticipated. Execution decisions, either opportunities or threats, if anticipated, are considered execution decisions. The decision maker anticipated them, communicated these decisions ahead of time to his subordinates, and now, when those threats and opportunities emerge, everyone knows what actions to take as the decisions were pre-made. Adjustment decisions, on the other hand, are much more difficult. These threats and opportunities were not anticipated prior to the inauguration of the plan to execution. This type of decision depends largely on the sensitivity of whoever detects the threat or opportunity first. This emphasizes the importance of leader development. Often, the decision maker with the most experience is not present when those threats or opportunities are first found. Please reflect on a time that you may have seen this occur. Have you ever seen a threat or an opportunity emerge that was not anticipated and attempt to get a decision maker to make a decision based on this new information? Was it easy? Were you able to get the plan back online to the envisioned end state? All that we have discussed in this brief review of literature that inspired our wargaming study is from a specifically military perspective. However, these notions are not limited exclusively to the military. We invite you to continue to reflect on the applicability of whatever context you may find yourself and your organization operating.
These are the general themes examined in the literature in support of this study. The Combat Training Center, CTC, reports established an enduring trend where the wargaming step of MDMP was either skipped, emerged during rehearsals, or was conducted more like a rehearsal than a cognitive stress test. These CTC reports suggest that military planners were systemically reluctant to question their plans. The coaching and leader development sources were examined in an effort to understand how experienced leaders might educate junior leaders on how to plan better, question assumptions, and recognize exceptional information. Researchers began to see this leader development process as an apprenticeship-style coaching approach, as senior leaders modeled for junior leaders more than practices, but the cognitive disciplines that might create the fertile minds to recognize the unanticipated threats or opportunities that exceptional information reveal. Game theory was examined as a tool to create the instrument employed during the visualization quiz, designed to gauge and participant comfort while making visualization decisions. Since this was a mixed method study, research spanning both approaches were examined to support the mixed methods approach. One of the things that the research team discovered was that military planners have a tendency to cut corners on the MDMP process. They justify this when they're in a time-constrained environment, i.e. the last 15 years of persistent conflict. However, when they do this, they degrade the process and potentially its outcomes. What we discovered during the course of our mixed methods study was that MDMP is also a mixed methods approach. However, over the past 15 years, military planners have removed most of the quantitative elements that enabled this planning process. Thus, the process is no longer as rigorous as it once was and has not been benefiting from the perspectives of both qualitative and quantitative aspects. We invite the audience to reflect on the utility of some of these notions to their context, whether it be business or academic or otherwise. What aspects of your planning process might resemble the cognitive planning domains? How comfortable do decision makers feel arriving at a decision? Is it realistic to expect that in our current, ever more complex environment that we will feel comfortable with uncertainty? It's interesting to consider this because each decision maker must decide how much certainty they must have before making the decision. If they decide too soon without enough information, they may make an ill-considered decision. However, if they wait too long, an opportunity might be squandered, and the threat may emerge so damaging that they might not ever recover. These findings are applicable to more than just the military context, if for no other reason than our world is becoming more, not less complex, and the rate of change is only expected to accelerate. If we accept these two variables as truth, finding ways to deal with the uncertainty in our environment and yet still make good decisions is an important pursuit. Thank you for your attention. I'll turn this over to Dr. Long to moderate some questions that might be useful for our discussion.
Thanks, Rich and Marty. The first one I want to start with had something to do with the disturbing trend at the combat training center. So that's where we go to make sure that our large, complex organizations can actually perform these very difficult functions of warfighting. And so we put them in an environment as close to reality as we can safely make it, and then see if they can pull everything together. And you talked about two things, wargaming and rehearsal, and they're not the same thing to us. We start a planning process, and then we prepare, and then we execute. So we use a plan, prepare, and execute model. And so the wargaming is an act of visualization that occurs in planning in order to help us understand what we're getting into. And it requires some visualization, true. The rehearsal is also a visualization exercise, but it's not really designed to discover something new about the environment. We're actually using that as a form of preparation to make sure that we can execute this plan. So although both of these functions rely heavily on the skill, the cognitive skill of visualization, they serve different purposes. And our observation over the years has been that if we perform the visualization poorly in wargaming, then it's not until the rehearsal occurs, just before we execute, that we discover some holes in our plan that were not uncovered early enough to make a difference. And so then we're in the dilemma of trying to make a change at the last minute that we're not really prepared for. So visualization isn't just a good idea if you can do it. It turns out to be a necessary condition to be successful in a complex world, that you have to do it early. And so I would distinguish between the purpose of the war game and the visualization and the purpose of the rehearsal. And so what I think we mentioned in the first webinar was this idea that visualization seems to be an important cognitive skill that supports many different kinds of decisions and kinds of functions in our organization. So that one just really struck me that what you're dealing with is something that is central to the development of leaders. That this isn't just a nice thing to do. It turns out to be a fundamental skill that we think they have to have in order to become successful.
Well, Ken, I think that's why I've displayed this first slide about visualization again, because a lot of the stuff that we educate our leaders on, and this may be true not only for the military but for also for civilian pursuits, is it would be so easy if everything about leadership had to do with a checklist that was easy to follow. But the complex environments that we face in our world today don't respond well to checklist approaches. Now, there's certain systems that you have to use some sort of a checklist, but being able to anticipate taking outside inputs, which can be quite complex, interpreting them, and then predicting what's going to happen that is not yet apparent, because the clues might be there, but only people with experience can see, okay, I've seen this before, and those were clues right there that this threat or opportunity is about to emerge. And so that's why I used, and I talked about this, The Big Short, because in The Big Short, you've got people who looked at a threat, the mortgage-backed securities are about to fail, and they could have used that as a trigger to decide to remove their funds from that. Instead, a lot of these individuals decided, okay, what can I do to turn this into an opportunity? Now, we can have long arguments about the ethics of what they did, but from the perspective of visualization, it was an excellent an example of taking some outside inputs, using their inner library of education and experience, interpreting this, and then being able to project onto the screen, this is the threat and how I can use that threat for my personal advantage. And we see this all the time in military pursuits. There's nothing more vulnerable than an ambushing unit, a unit that's getting ready to ambush another unit, an enemy unit, that has been discovered. If they've been discovered, now they're in danger. and the enemy can turn that into an opportunity against them. So it's all about visualization.
So it only took the failure of one assumption to make them very vulnerable. You know, I had a chance to talk with a guy named Kyle Bass, who's a legendary investor who made his first fortune during The Big Short. And I asked him what it was like to be Kyle Bass talking to other people about his ideas. And what he said was that he could see the Big Short coming and the failure of those instruments as clear as day. He could see it unfold in his mind, just like dominoes falling one after another. And he could see it, visualization, but other people, they couldn't make that mental picture. They could hear the words, but they couldn't see how it might look in action. And then after The Big Short happened, everybody could see why that was the only thing that could happen. So in retrospect, it always seems very clear. And so in the warm-up phase for this, we were talking about that blinding flash of the obvious, or the strike of lightning, the aha moment that allows you to pull together all of the mundane pieces of information into some organizing narrative or some movie or a picture that just pulls everything together. And it struck me that that like CCIR, that Commander's Critical Information Requirements, might be one of the ways in which you can generate those kinds of lightning strikes that focus our attention on certain pieces of information, and the ability to visualize that seems pretty crucial to me. The next thing I wanted to talk about was I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here a little bit and say, well, you know, you guys spent a couple hundred hours studying this and putting together an exercise and visualizing, and you discovered that visualizing really turns out to be important and that you can teach it. Why can't I just take your slides and lecture to students and tell them why visualization is important, and then get on to the next set of topics? Because we're professionals here and there's a million topics to cover. Why isn't it just good enough to just tell them the truth, to tell them that they have to visualize? Why don't I have to go through the trouble?
Ken, I think that's a very good question that that several of our colleagues have asked us, and I think the answer to that is visualization is a cyclical and time-intensive process that you've got to do over and over and over again, with a feedback loop associated with that. So as a senior leader or a senior commander, you're visualizing, but then you've got to describe that visualization to your subordinates in a way that they can understand it and apply it at their level, so they can do the same with their subordinates. And I think it's much more than a series of PowerPoint slides. It's experiential learning, and that's critical to what we're trying to do.
Well, you know, Nathan Bedford Forrest, I think, is the guy who said, "Talking ain't fighting," and in some ways, hearing isn't doing. And you mentioned the word a couple times, apply, and putting it into motion and doing the thing. That there are things that you can only learn by doing, no matter how clear and obvious it seems. I was just at an exercise with a large headquarters, a National Guard division. That's 20,000 guys going to go to Afghanistan and put it on the line for the nation. And they were working through their command post, their command center processes. And I recognized some guys that have been to our school that were students of mine that got excellent grades from me. And yet when they were placed in an environment in which they had to put it into action, they were really suffering. It's like they had too much information. They didn't know how to proceed. And it wasn't until we actually could diagram a process and then visualize it and then apply that in slow motion and then add repetitions like you're describing, that they could become a functional command post, a functional organization that could put things in motion.
The thing that I think that's interesting about that too, Ken, is because we see this, you know, you those of us here in this institution, we're all former military leaders, but we're also scholars, helping students, you know, with their master's theses, etc. And the thing that I find is that if a student struggles creating a good problem statement and aligning that problem statement with a research question or a hypothesis, they're going to struggle with their study. And yet we've seen the same problem in the field for units that are struggle writing a good commander's critical information requirement, which is the same as a research question in a lot of ways, or a hypothesis. We called it simply things that the staff and the commander are trying to find out. But that's the same thing if you're conducting a study. And if you cannot write a good research question or hypothesis in order to support your study, we all know that a student is going to struggle. Well, the same thing is true for people who are trying to solve problems that exist in the operational environment. If I don't articulately describe, as a commander or a leader, hey, this is what I need to know because it relates directly to a decision that must be made. If I don't do that well, the people who are now looking for this stuff, and we only have so many assets for collecting information, if I do that poorly, then I squander those assets, and then I potentially miss the opportunities and threats, because that's how we find out if they're there. We go and look, and if we see them, that's like finding data that supports your hypothesis or things that support your addressing your problem statement.
And Rich, I think it's important to reiterate the fact that the CCIR, the Commander's Critical Information Requirements, are questions that drive the commander's decision, either confirming or denying. Answering the question in a positive or a negative is going to drive a decision that the commander is going to make sometime in the execution. Building on what you two gentlemen talked about with movies, I thought back to General Buford in the movie Gettysburg, and when General Buford and his staff and subordinate commanders come across the town of Gettysburg before the fight has actually started, on how he portrayed to his subordinates his information requirements and his visualization of the fight that was about to come, and through the lens of Hollywood and through the lens of history, he was able to do that and help the Union forces succeed.
Yeah, Buford's narrative in that movie lasts about 2 minutes, but in 2 minutes he's able to encompass the entire scope of a very complex battle. And in 2 minutes of narration and almost verbal visualization, he paints the picture with words. He's able to communicate the essence of what's important to his entire staff. And his entire staff is going to be out there working on parts of the problem and writing their own supporting orders and having to coordinate with people. And it was the central organizing principle of that vision that's going to allow them to synchronize their activities in time and space. And so visualization doesn't just help you as a cognitive tool to come to a decision. It actually endures all the way through operations and implementation and into the next battle as a communication device. And it's the difference between a picture or a snapshot and a movie. The movie and that visualization communicates the dynamic elements of this complex battlefield. And so we really use that war game to explore the possibility space. That what we want with our plan is not a scripted, step-by-step, control freak approach to reality, but really to set boundaries within which we can operate successfully. If we do a good job in planning, we've seen the limits of what the enemy can do and what we can do, and now we have anticipated how this battle might flow within the boundaries that we've created. And so we can go from decision to decision and learn how to find the risks or the weaknesses or where those boundaries might be poorly placed, because we've experienced many different ways the battle could unfold. And so by being able to replay that in our minds 10 times, 100 times.
Well, the other thing too, I'd add to this,
surprise.
The thing that's interesting about this, Ken, and this is the part that I've reflected on during the course of this study, and that is, when you look at The Big Short and you look at Buford as two examples, leaders in those examples were able to anticipate something that had never been seen before. Mortgages were always a sure investment, so why would they fail? Oh, well, because the way they started using these things changed and nobody noticed. Buford was a cavalryman during a time where cavalry almost never dismounted. But he saw that if they didn't hold the approaches to the high ground in Gettysburg, that the Union would fail. And so he dismounted in a time where cavalrymen never dismounted. He dismounted his people, had them dig in, and he fought, taking incredible losses. most of his compadres at the time, his colleagues at the time, would have said that's a pretty bad move. And yet, there are historians who argue because of Buford's actions, the Union got a success that probably wouldn't have been theirs. And so instead of the Confederates going across with Pickett's charge on day 3, would have been the Union, and the rest would have been history. Who knows what would have happened as a result of this? So it's back to these taking multiple iterations and getting practice. Not only prepares you for the opportunities and threats that you may have seen before, but ones that may have never ever been seen before, but because that muscle has been exercised cognitively, it has the ability to break out of, normal cognitive thinking and anticipate things that have never been seen before.
Yeah, so in one way, this kind of planning and operations, it's not like solving a math problem in algebra, where I have a start point and then I find the right rule, I apply it, and then I can derive the correct answer in a standard way, and then that's the right answer. It's much more like juggling and finding different ways that I might arrange pieces in time and space, and it's only through that rapid reorienting and reorganizing and mixing things together and then determining the possibilities and the outcomes. I have to conduct many little visual experiments in my effort in order to find the boundaries of my plan or to expose the weak spots. And so there's a rapid cycle of iterative thinking that goes in with visualization. I'm visualizing it so I don't have to try and find out. It's not good enough to just guess and then go see what happens when you have lives on the line and the nation's security is at risk. There's a professional obligation to us in this profession to understand how to visualize so that we can make better plans because of the consequences of failure. And I would argue that all professions face that kind of pressure to get it right when they're taking action on behalf of a society, whether it's engineers or doctors or lawyers or politicians or merchants, or a guy who's designing the next consumer product and trying to figure out how it could go wrong or how it's going to go right. That act of visualization, in my view, is a core competency for all the professions. And so if we can find ways to teach that, to learn how to do it better, then we're making direct contributions to the central purpose of the profession, and that is to get it right the first time when money and lives are on the line and success really does matter. So I think it's really important that we have these kinds of cross-professional discussions so that we can learn from each other in new and surprising ways sometimes. And so we hope that we've kept your interest here, and I thank Rich and Marty for a review of the literature that goes into this science project that they've put together. And I really just want to emphasize the importance of the blend of theory and the blend of practice that you're bringing together. It's both theory and practice coming to some effective action in our purpose going forward. So I want to say thanks to you guys, and I look forward to webinar number 3. I can't wait. I wish you were ready to go with it right now because I'm ready to keep learning. So thanks for your kind attention out there. And as always, we're interested in any comments or questions you may have. If you'll send it to me at kenneth.e.long20.civ, C-I-V, at mail.mil, at the email on the screen, then we will feed that forward into the next set of webinars. So thanks for your kind attention, and be safe out there.